There are things I have never said out loud. Not in interviews. Not in boardrooms. Not in any room where cameras were pointed at me, and people were waiting for something impressive to come out of my mouth. This is different. I am not here to impress you. I am here because there are words that have been sitting inside me for a long time, words that feel urgent in a way I cannot fully explain. Not because I am running out of time in the dramatic sense, but because I have learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that most people wait too long to say the things that matter. They assume there will be another moment, another chance, another conversation. And then there is not. So if you are willing to sit with me in this, I want to speak to you directly. Not as a public figure, not as someone with rockets and headlines and all the noise that follows me everywhere. Just as a man who has been thinking quietly about what it means to really reach someone before the moment closes. Will you listen? Because what I have to say, it was always meant for you. If you are still here, stay with me. I am going to reveal something at the end that you do not want to miss. And if you are interested, subscribe to my channel. I want to start with something most people never say to someone like you. Not the polite things. Not the surface things. I want to start with what I actually see when I think about a woman who has lived as long and as deeply as you have. I see someone who has held things together for decades without ever being asked if she was tired. Someone who showed up morning after morning, year after year, for other people, for routines, for responsibilities that were not glamorous and did not come with applause. I see someone who loved in ways that were quiet and constant, the kind of love that does not photograph well, but holds everything in place without anyone noticing until it is gone. I notice that. Deep. You learn to wait until the house is still. You learn to feel things in the space between tasks, briefly, before moving on to the next thing that needs you. You become very good at managing the inside while maintaining the outside. I recognize that silence because I have lived inside one of my own. Mine looked different from yours. The pressures were different. The public nature of my life meant that what showed on the outside was constantly being scrutinized and analyzed and turned into headlines. But underneath all of it, underneath the launches and the announcements and the things that made people call me brilliant or reckless or both, there was a man who sometimes sat alone at night and felt the weight of everything he had chosen. Everything that had cost him something he could not name on a spreadsheet. I am telling you this not to draw a comparison. Not to suggest that my struggles and yours are equivalent. They are not. You have endured things I have not. You have loved and lost in ways I can only partially understand. But I am telling you this because I think the deepest loneliness does not announce itself loudly. It does not walk into the room and declare itself. It sits beside you quietly, dressed up as discipline, as duty, as the simple habit of being fine. And I have learned that the most important conversations, the real ones, the ones that actually change something inside a person, begin with one person recognizing that quiet in another and saying, I see it. I am not afraid of it. You do not have to perform strength for me right now. So let me say that to you. You do not have to perform anything right now. Not here. Not with me. I have spent most of my life in motion. That is the honest truth. From the moment I understood that I had the pull together, a crisis to manage, a vision to protect, the motion was real, and the work was real. Cost is this. When you are always moving, you learn to postpone the things that require you to be still. If I actually sat with the weight of what I was carrying, I was not sure I would be able to get back up and continue. So I kept going. I optimized the schedule. I found efficiency in everything. And somewhere inside all of that efficiency, certain things, certain human things, got deferred. Conversations that needed to happen. Pauses that needed to be taken. Moments with people I cared about that passed too quickly because I was already thinking about what came next. I do not say this with self-pity. I say it because I think you might understand it from a different angle. You may have spent years giving your energy so completely to the people around you, your children, your husband, your community, your home, that your own inner life got quietly deferred. Not abandoned. Just postponed, again and again, again until the deferral became a kind of habit you forgot you had started. And then one day something shifted. A chair became permanently empty at the table. A season of life ended, and a new one began, and nobody handed you a map. And in the quiet that followed, all those deferred things started surfacing, not violently, but steadily. Like water rising slowly in a room you had kept tightly sealed. That is when everything becomes more tender, more honest, more complicated. I think about what that kind of quiet arrival must feel like for a woman who has spent 60 or 70 or more years being someone for others. The way it must be disorienting at first, this unexpected expanse of time. Because what is changed is the shape of your days, the shape of your purpose, the shape of who knows your name and says it out loud with genuine warmth. And I think about how a person can begin to wonder, quietly, whether the best of life is behind her. Whether what is left is simply maintenance. Managing health, managing solitude, managing the graceful descent. Answers what the quietness suggests. I have built things that should not have been possible by standard reasoning. I have watched rockets that should have stayed on the ground lift themselves into the sky after years of expensive failure. I have seen companies that were declared dead by every reasonable metric find their footing and become something that changed what people thought was achievable. None of that happened because the conditions were ideal. It happened because somewhere in the middle of the difficulty, a different question got asked. Not, is this going to work? But, what would it look like if it worked? And am I willing to stay long enough to find out? I am asking you a version of that question right now. Not about rockets, not about companies, about your own remaining life, the days that are actually still in front of you. And I want to ask it without pretending I know what your particular circumstances look like, without reducing you to a category, or a statistic, or a demographic. I am asking it because I think you are someone who deserves to hear it asked plainly. What would it look like if the next chapter of your life, not despite your age, not in spite of what you have lost, but including all of it, was actually worth something, not just to the people around you, to you? I remember the first time I genuinely confronted my own sense of limitation, not as a thought experiment or a philosophical exercise, but as a visceral about ambition, and partly about something I had not fully admitted to myself, a low-grade fear that if I slowed down, I would feel how much I had not resolved. And when I finally let myself feel it, when I stopped engineering around it, and just sat with it, something unexpected happened. It did not destroy me. It clarified me. It told me what actually mattered. It stripped away the noise I would been generating to avoid the signal. And what the signal said, simply, quietly, was, the things that last are not the things built on ambition alone. The things that last are built on genuine connection, on being actually known by instrument the world uses. And I will tell you with complete honesty that the moments of success I remember with the deepest feeling are not the launches. They are not the milestones. They are the quieter things. The conversations that went long because neither person wanted them to end. The moments when someone looked at me, not at my accomplishments, not at the public projection of who I was supposed to be, but at me, as a human being with doubts and fatigue, and a genuine need to be understood. Those moments are rare. I think you know that. And I think you know what it is to have been that presence for others, steady, constant, emotionally available, while not always having it returned in kind. I think you know what it is to give your deep attention to someone, and to quietly wonder if anyone was paying that same quality of attention to you. I am paying it now, not as a performance, not as a technique, but because I genuinely believe that a woman who has lived as fully as you have, who has navigated grief and love, and the long work of raising a life into something worth living deserves to be spoken to with the kind of honesty that does not flinch. And I have more to say. Thinking years pass, and understanding that how you use what is left is the last great choice you get to make. There are things that only reveal themselves slowly, not because they are hidden exactly, but because you have to reach a certain depth of living before you can recognize them, before the noise settles enough for you to see what was always there underneath it. I have been thinking about failure lately, not in the way people might expect, not with regret or bitterness, or the need to justify any on them honestly, instead of defending against it. Because here's what I have learned. Failure does not just show you what went wrong. It shows you who you actually are when the structure collapses. When the thing you built breaks apart in front of people who are watching. When the version of yourself you presented to the world gets exposed as incomplete, or mistaken, or simply not enough for that particular moment. And failures. Some of them spectacular by any measure. Early rocket launches that did not make it. Financial crises inside companies I would poured everything into. Moments where serious, credentialed people looked at what I was attempting and said, plainly, that I was going to lose. And not gently. With a kind of certainty that was designed to land. What those people did not know, what almost no one knows about those periods, is what it felt like at night. After the meetings. After the calls. After the public-facing composure had been carefully maintained for another full day. It felt like carrying a building on your shoulders while pretending the weight was not there. Not because I was trying to deceive anyone, but because the moment you let people see the full weight, something shifts in how they relate to you. They start trying to save you, or they start distancing from what they perceive as a sinking ship. And neither of those respond the weight in a particular way. Quietly. Privately. With a practiced stillness that functions as composure, but is actually something more complex, a decision, made daily, to continue when continuing is not the obvious or comfortable choice. I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever made a decision like that? Not a dramatic one. Not a decision with headlines or witnesses, but one of those interior decisions, small seeming from the outside, that actually require the decision to answer the phone, to show up at the table, to cook the meal, to say yes to one more day when the honest answer in your body was that you were not sure you had another day in you. I think you have. I think you have made that decision more times than you can count. And I think no one gave you a ceremony for it. No one framed it and put it on the wall. It was just another Tuesday. Just another act of private endurance that the world absorbed without acknowledgement. That quiet endurance is not a small thing. The moment when years of work becomes a single dramatic image that everyone can photograph and share. We build entire narratives around the visible moments because they are easy to point to, easy to measure, easy to put in a presentation and say, this is what success looks like. But the real structure underneath any lasting thing is made of invisible moments. It is made of the decisions nobody saw. The mornings where continuing was genuinely difficult, and the person continued anyway. The years of showing up without reward, without recognition, without even the internal certainty that it was going to mean anything in the end. Those invisible moments are the actual foundation. It is not the visible milestones. I see the foundation. I see what it was actually built on. And it is substantial. I think about my own mother sometimes when I think about this kind of invisible endurance. She raised 3 children, largely alone, in circumstances that were difficult in ways she rarely discussed. She did not dramatize the difficulty. She did not ask for ongoing recognition of what it cost her. She just continued. And in that continuing, in that daily, unglamorous, uncelebrated act of continuing, she built something in her children that no external achievement could have produced. That difficulty is not the same as defeat. That the morning always comes, even when the night is very long. She is older now. And what I notice in her, what strikes me when I see her, is that the endurance has not diminished her. It has deepened her. There is a quality in people who have truly been through things and remain themselves, a density of presence, a groundedness, a kind of weight that is not heaviness, but is something more like genuine substance. You have that. I can feel it even through this distance, even in this unusual form of conversation. You have the substance that comes from a life actually lived, not managed from a safe distance, not observed from behind. I think it costs more than people admit. Real engagement, the kind where you are truly present, truly invested, truly open to being affected by what happens, is not free. Every person you love deeply is a vulnerability. Every year you give yourself honestly to something, or someone is a year you cannot reclaim if it does not hold. And a woman who has lived as many years as you have, has accumulated the grief of things that ended, people who left, seasons that closed before she was ready. That combination, the wealth and the debt, held simultaneously, is one of the most complex emotional conditions a human being can inhabit. Most people try to resolve it by choosing one side. Either they decide the wealth outweighs everything and lean into gratitude as a way of not feeling the loss, or they decide the debt is the real story and use it as a reason to stop investing, to protect what is left by no longer risking it. But there is a third option that I find more honest and ultimately more useful. And it is harder than either of the first two. It is the choice to hold both. To say, yes, I have lost things that gave me identity and purpose that no longer apply. A particular kind of aliveness that belonged to a season that has passed. I hold all of that. I am not going to minimize it or rush past it or dress it in language that makes it neater than it actually is. And the fact that I have lost things does not mean that I am finished. Those two things can be true simultaneously. The grief is real, and the possibility is real. The closing was real, and the opening may also be real. Sitting inside both of those truths at once, without collapsing into the one or rushing toward the other, that is where the most honest life actually lives. I know how to build things. I know how to hold a vision steady while everything around it is telling you the vision is impossible. But I have also learned, painfully slowly, through the willingness to continue in the presence of doubt. The willingness to keep the door open when every reasonable voice was suggesting I close it. I am asking you to consider a version of that willingness for yourself. Not the ambitious kind. What would it feel like to let something new find me? Not to go searching for it desperately. Not to manufacture hope where none exists. But simply to remain open, genuinely, specifically open to the possibility that the life still in front of you contains something worth arriving at. Because here is what I know about time, from watching it closely, and sometimes spending it badly. It does not actually owe you clarity in advance. It does not offer guarantees before the experience. The most meaningful things in my life, the relationships that mattered most, the work that felt most real, the moments I returned to with actual warmth, none of them arrived with advance notice. None of them came packaged in certainty. They came quietly, sideways, into moments when I was not looking for them, open, at this particular stage of life. I think about how the world, with its relentless focus on youth, on speed, on visible productivity, makes it easy for a woman of your experience and depth to quietly conclude that the doors are closing, that the best seasons are accounted for, that what remains is diminishment rather than arrival. I want to push back on that conclusion very directly, not with empty encouragement, not with the kind of bright, cheerful reassurance that does not actually land because it does not acknowledge the real weight of where you have been, but with something I have earned through my own version of difficulty and continuation, the genuine conviction that the capacity to be surprised, to be moved, to be genuinely reached by something new, that capacity does not expire on a fixed schedule. It closes when people decide it is closed, not before. And you have not decided that. If you had, the courage to sit with an open hand rather than a closed fist when life keeps presenting things you did not plan for. I respect that kind of courage deeply, more than the visible kind, more than the dramatic kind, because it is the kind that no one gives you a ceremony for, and you do it anyway, day after day, in the private space of your own continuing life. I am not finished. There are things I need to say about what I have learned from the people I have lost, not just about loss itself, but about what those losses clarified for me, about what they changed and how I think about the time that remains for any of us. Loss changes the architecture of a person, not immediately, not in the dramatic, visible way that the first days of grief suggest it will. In those early days, grief feels total, like weather that has moved inside the walls, into every room, in calls, and the particular, careful tenderness that humans extend to each other in acute pain. But then that period ends. Life resumes its forward motion around you. The phone calls become less frequent. The casseroles stop arriving. The world, gently, without malice, simply because it has its own continuing business, moves on. And you are left with something quieter and more permanent than the acute grief. You are left with the restructured interior. The rooms that used to hold certain sounds, certain presences, certain reliable textures of daily life, and now hold something else. Not emptiness exactly, but a changed quality of space. I have lost people. I will not specify all of them or rank the losses in order of magnitude, because I do not think loss works that way, and I do not think you would trust me more for doing it. But I have sat in rooms that used to hold someone and felt the specific weight of their the particular angle of light at a certain hour. The sounds that you associate so completely with their presence, that when those sounds arrive in that half second where the mind reaches for someone who is not there, that may be the most honest emotional experience I know. It does not resolve neatly. It does not respond to logic. It just happens quietly in the middle of ordinary moments, and you absorb it and continue. Because that is what you do. Because the alternative is to stop, and stopping is not actually available to you. I want to talk about what that kind of loss does to your relationship with the present moment. Because here is something I have noticed, something I did not expect, and could not have predicted. Loss, over time, does something unexpected to the quality of your attention. It sharpens it. For the specific quality of an unremarkable conversation to be something you would, later, give almost anything to have back. That knowledge is heavy. I will not pretend it is not. The weight of knowing how temporary everything is, not as an abstraction, but as a felt, personal truth, does not make life feel lighter. It makes every moment carry more of its own gravity, more of its own significance. And significance, sustained over time, is exhausting in a way that people who have not reached this stage of life do not fully understand. What I want to offer you, carefully, without overstating it, is a reframe of that weight, not a dismissal of it, not a cheerful suggestion that you should feel differently than you do, but a genuine question about whether the weight you are carrying is all burden, or whether some portion of it is actually ballast, whether the depth that comes from surviving loss, the specific gravity of a life that has genuinely encountered its own fragility and continued anyway, is not diminishment but a form of enlargement that most people never reach. I have worked alongside brilliant people my entire adult life. Technically brilliant, strategically brilliant, creatively brilliant people who could solve complex problems with a speed and elegance that are not the same as wisdom. The ability to process information rapidly is not the same as the ability to stakes are highest, and I need judgment that will not fail under pressure, are almost always people who have been through something real. People who have stood inside a genuine loss, or a genuine failure, or a genuine reckoning, and come out the other side still fundamental. That particular form of tested, durable integrity cannot be studied into existence. It cannot be optimized or reverse engineered. It can only be lived. You have lived it. And I want to say something about that directly, because I think it is possible that no one has said it to you in quite this way. The years you have spent navigating difficult things, the losses, the adjustments, the seasons that required more of you than felt fair, those years did not deplete you. They refined you. They burned away the less essential things and left something that is, in its own way, extraordinary. The extraordinary part is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is simply this: a person who has genuinely lived, who has loved fully and lost honestly, and continued with their fundamental character intact, carries a quality of presence that cannot be manufactured, a groundedness, a capacity for genuine response to other people that comes only from having been genuinely tested yourself. I want to tell you something personal now, something I have not said in public, because the public context does not have room for it, and because honesty requires a certain kind of intimacy that press conferences do not provide. There have been periods in my life, specific, identifiable periods, when I felt genuinely unseen. Not misunderstood in the way that gets discussed publicly, where people debate your intentions or your methods or your public decisions, but unseen in the deeper sense. The sense where the people physically closest to you do not actually perceive who you are inside the accomplishments, where the version of you that exists in other people's minds is that version is effectively alone. That particular loneliness, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who know it can be chosen. It can be a form of restoration. But the loneliness of being present and unseen, that is something else. Something that sits in the chest differently. Something that creates a very specific hunger. Not for company, Exactly, but for recognition. For the experience of being genuinely perceived by another person. Of having someone look at you, not at your output, not at your reputation, not at the useful version of you they require, but at you, specifically, in your actual complexity, and remain. I think you know that hunger. I think you may have felt it inside relationships that were real in their way, that were genuine commitments, that held through decades, and yet still left something unnamed, still left a part of you that was not fully reached. Not because the people who loved you were inadequate or unkind, but because that particular depth of recognition is rare. Because most people, in the press of their own lives and their own interior concerns, cannot consistently hold the kind of attention that genuine recognition requires. And when that goes unmet for a long time, when a person spends years giving deep attention to others, while that quality of attention is not fully returned, something happens that is easy to misread. You can begin to conclude that the unmet hunger means something is wrong with you, that your need to be truly seen is somehow excessive, that the hunger itself is the problem, that a more reasonable person, a more adjusted person, would not need this so acutely. You begin to quietly edit the hunger down, to make peace with less, to tell yourself that what you have is enough, and that needing more is a form of ingratitude. I want to say this as plainly as I know how. That conclusion is wrong. The hunger to be director or your capacity for contentment. It is one of the most fundamental. Hunger persists in people who have not yet decided to stop, who have not yet concluded that the depth of connection they are capable of is no longer available to them, who are still, quietly, without announcing it, holding space for the possibility that something real might still find them. That persistence matters. It matters more than I can adequately express in a single conversation. Because I have seen what happens when people stop holding that space. When they make the final accommodation, the one where they close that particular door, and call it acceptance, and move efficiently through their remaining days. There is a quality that leaves them, a specific light. And what remains is functional and often dignified, and sometimes even peaceful. But it is not the full thing. It is a life running on a reduced interior. You are not running on reduced. Whatever you may feel in your harder moments, whatever the quiet hours suggest about your diminishment, or your irrelevance, or the narrowing of what is still possible, the fact of your hunger contradicts it. The fact that you can still be reached, still be moved, still be present enough to sit inside these words and feel them, that is not a small fact. That is the most important fact about you right now. And I have more to say about what I have learned from the people who stayed, and why their staying changed everything about how I understand what we owe each other, about what loyalty actually looks like when it has been tested by time and difficulty, and the specific pressure of a life that did not unfold the way anyone planned. Loyalty is one of those words that gets used so casually it has almost lost its shape. People say it easily. In toasts, in vows, in the ordinary declarations of affection that fill a life with the texture of belonging. And holding it across decades, across the specific gravity of real time, real difficulty, real change, those are two entirely different acts. And the difference between them is where the pressure. Alliances that held perfectly until the moment they became inconvenient, and then released cleanly and without apparent remorse. I have seen people I considered close become strangers with remarkable efficiency the moment the relationship stopped, serving something they needed. And I have watched loyalty hold in ways that were quiet and almost unremarked. A person who stayed when staying cost them something real, who remained present during a period when presence required genuine effort and offered no immediate return, who chose, again and again, in small daily ways that no one was recording, to honor a commitment that the circumstances kept inviting them to release. The second kind, the quiet, costly, daily kind, that is the loyalty that actually means something, and it is rarer than the world likes to admit. I want to speak to what it means to have been that kind of loyal, to have stayed across the long arc of something, a marriage, a family, a life built with another person through seasons that were not all gentle, to have shown up, year after year, with the kind of faithfulness that does not photograph well, and does not receive ongoing recognition, because it becomes, over time, simply the assumed texture of who you are. The world takes that kind of faithfulness for granted. It absorbs it without full acknowledgement because it is steady, and steadiness, unlike crisis, unlike triumph, unlike the dramatic peaks and valleys that draw attention, steadiness is invisible by nature. It holds things in place so quietly that people forget it is holding anything. But remove it, and everything catastrophic. Not the people who generated the announcements. Not the people whose names appeared in the coverage. The ones who maintained the integrity of the system quietly, consistently, over long periods without anyone noticing, because the system was working. Their invisibility was a direct function of their competence. Your faithfulness worked the same way. The life you held together, intelligent, emotionally costly work that happened largely without an audience. And I want to name something that I think sits alongside that faithfulness in a complicated way. Not with the drama of resentment, but quietly, in the particular way that long-deferred things accumulate. You may not even have a complete accounting of what was set aside. You may not remember the specific moments of deferral, because there were so many of them, and they were each so unremarkable individually. But the total weight of them is real. And I think that weight is part of what makes this particular stage of life so complex. Because the deferral period is over now. The structure that required constant maintenance has changed shape. The roles that organized your time and your attention have evolved or ended. And in the space that remains, all those deferred things are present in a new way. Not as accusations you are when you are not primarily defined by what you do for others. About what you actually want when want is genuinely available. About which parts of yourself were temporarily set aside, and which parts were, perhaps, quietly abandoned without a formal decision being made. I have had to ask myself versions of those questions, and I will tell you honestly that I did not find the asking comfortable. There is a particular discomfort in confronting the distance between the life you have been living and the interior life you have been managing around it, between the public construction and the private reality, between what you present and what you actually care. It is a sign that something true is trying to surface, and things that are true, genuinely, essentially true about a person deserve to surface. They deserve the space and the light and the honest attention that only comes when the performing and the maintaining and the managing finally pause long enough for the real things to be heard. What do you actually want? Not what seems reasonable at your age. Not what you think is still available. Not what you have been told to want by a culture that has specific bones in that deep interior place that knows the difference between genuine desire and acceptable compromise. I am not asking that rhetorically. I am asking it because I think it is a question you may have been avoiding. Not out of cowardice. Nothing about you suggests cowardice, but out of a kind of protective practicality. The question feels dangerous when you are not sure the answer can be honored. When you are not sure the territory it points toward is still accessible. When the honest answer might expose a gap between what is and what you still, despite everything, wish for. I understand that particular caution. I have practiced versions of it myself. There are things I want with everything else I was responsible for. And for long periods, that rationalization was functional. It let me keep moving. It let me stay focused on the things that needed immediate attention. But rationalization has a shelf life. At some point, the thing you have been rationalizing around begins to cost you more than the original want would have. Because what happens when you defer genuine wants for long enough is that a low-grade grief installs itself in the background of your life. Not sharp enough to demand attention. Not specific enough to address directly. But present, steadily, as a kind of muted coloring over everything. A slight dulling of the quality of experience that you cannot quite source. The remedy for that grief is not dramatic. It does not require radical reinvention. It does not require you to dismantle anything, or declare anything, or perform a transformation for an audience. It requires something quieter, and, in my experience, more difficult than any of those things. It requires honesty with yourself about what is actually still alive inside you. Not what should be alive. Not what would be convenient to have alive. But what actually is the real remaining wants, the genuine unclosed hungers, the parts of you that did not agree to the slow demit I have come to believe is the most important kind. Not the courage that makes headlines. Not the courage that appears in the moments everyone is watching. but the courage of private honesty. The courage of sitting alone with yourself in the full truth of your own life. Not the edited version, not the graceful version, not the version that makes peace with everything and asks for nothing, but the actual version, with all its remaining wants, all its unresolved grief. Because professionally, the risk is external. The consequences are financial, reputational, structural, painful, yes, but located outside the self. The private honesty I am describing risks something more central. It risks the organized story you have been telling yourself about your own life. The narrative that makes sense of the choices, and the losses, and the long arc of everything you have been through. And yet, without that honesty, the remaining years close around a smaller and smaller version of you. Not because the world forces that narrowing, but because it happens by default when a person stops asking the real questions. When they accept the reduced version not as a choice, but as an inevitability. When they confuse the habit of living small with the wisdom of acceptance. Those are not the same thing. Genuine acceptance, the real kind, the earned kind, is spacious. It holds loss and possibility simultaneously without requiring you to choose between them. It says, I am exactly where I am, with exactly what I have been through. And from here I am still capable of genuine movement towards something real. The habit of living small is different. It says, this is what remains, and wanting more than this is foolish, and I will protect myself from foolishness by no longer wanting. I am asking you directly, personally, with complete sincerity, not to make that trade. Because I have watched what becomes of people who make it. Of someone who has stopped requiring the world to be other than it is. And you have not completed yours. Whatever the evidence suggests, you have not completed yours. I know this not because I can see your future. I cannot, but because the capacity for genuine response that brought you here, to this conversation, in this moment, is not the capacity of someone who has finished. It is the capacity of someone who is still, in the most essential sense, in motion. Still reaching. Still capable of being surprised by something true. And there is something true I still need to tell you about what I have learned from the long relationships in my life, not the professional ones, but the ones that involved real emotional risk. The ones where I let someone close enough to disappoint me, close enough to know my actual failures, close enough to see the interior of a life that the public version of me was carefully constructed to obscure. What those relationships taught me, even the ones that did not last, perhaps especially because it deserves its own space. It deserves to be said carefully, without rush, in a way that gives it the weight it actually carries. The closest I ever came to understanding what it means to be truly known by another person was also the closest I came to understanding how much I had been hiding. Not deliberately, not with any calculated intention to deceive, but in the way that people who have learned to present strength as their primary offering to the world inevitably hide, by default, by long practice, by the accumulated habit of leading with capability and managing everything else quietly behind it. The relationship that taught me this was not the most dramatic one, and had finally decided to say what they saw. They said, "You share everything except yourself." I sat with that for a long time. I still sit with it, because it was accurate in a way that went deeper than any criticism I had received publicly, deeper than any professional failure, deeper in an effort to everything around me, while keeping the most interior part, the doubting, wondering, genuinely uncertain part, behind a door that stayed closed, even when I thought it was open. I wonder if you recognize any version of that in yourself. Not the same configuration, not the same history, but the particular habit of being present and capable and emotionally available for the people around you, while maintaining a private interior room you do not ask out loud reside, where the wants you have rationalized away still sit quietly, where the grief you have managed so gracefully for others occasionally surfaces in its full, unmanaged form just for you. Most people live with that room locked for so long that they stop noticing it is there. The lock becomes part of the furniture. The habit of privacy becomes indistinguishable from the self. And when someone comes close enough to notice the door, close enough to say, gently, that they would like to know what is inside, the first response is almost always discomfort. Not because you do not want to be known, but because being known requires something that years of managed presentation have made genuinely difficult. It requires letting someone see you before you have made the thing presentable. I have had to learn that. Not quickly. Not comfortably. It was simply the true one. Moments I failed to take, because the act of being genuinely seen felt more dangerous than any professional risk I would ever taken. And what I have come to understand, what I can now say with the confidence of someone who has actually tested it, is that the fear of being seen is not proportional to the actual danger. The thing you are protecting when you keep the interior room locked is not as fragile as the locking implies. The real you, the full, complex, doubting, wanting, sometimes lost, and sometimes absolutely certain version is not going to break under genuine attention. It is going to breathe. There is I am not sure it is even desirable. But accurately, when the version of you that exists in another person's perception aligns closely enough with the version you actually inhabit that the gap between them stops requiring maintenance. That relief is unlike anything I can describe through achievement. It does not feel like winning. It does not feel like solving. I want to talk about what makes that kind of knowing possible. Because it does not happen automatically. It does not happen simply because two people are in proximity, or even because they care about each other. It requires a specific set of conditions that do not arise by accident. It requires someone who is willing to pay the particular quality of attention that sees past the presentation, who is patient enough and curious enough and secure enough in themselves to wait for the real thing rather than accepting the surface version, because the surface version is easier and less demanding and fits more neatly into what they expected to find. That kind of attention is rare. I have encountered it a handful of times in my life. And the quality of their attention, the genuine, unhurried, non-transactional quality of it, created a space where honesty became possible in a way it normally is not. I think you have offered that quality of attention to people throughout your life. I think you are someone who has the capacity to truly see another person, to look past what they present, and perceive something of what they actually carry. And that this capacity has been one of your most quietly significant gifts to the people fortunate enough to receive it. And I think it is possible that you have not always had it returned in the same measure. Not because the people in your life were unwilling, but because that quality of attention requires a particular kind of development that not everyone reaches. It requires having been sufficiently tested by life, sufficiently humbled by your own limitations, sufficiently acquainted with your own complexity, to stop relating to other people primarily through the lens of what you need from them, and begin relating through genuine curiosity, things that mattered, and surviving the wrongness with your character still intact. And because it takes all of that, it tends to arrive fully in people later rather than earlier. In the years when life has done its most success right now, at this specific point in your life, with everything you have been through and everything it has cost, and everything it has built in you, this version is the one most capable of that depth of genuine exchange. Not the younger version. Not the version that was perhaps more conventionally available, more externally vibrant, more aligned with what the culture recognizes as relevant. This version. The one shaped by the full weight of a life actually lived. I have made significant errors in judgment across my life. I have been wrong about people in ways that cost me, and wrong about situations in ways that cost others. With the most honest recognition of its cost is the error of waiting too long to say the true thing. Waiting until the moment felt safer, until the conditions seemed more appropriate, until I had more certainty about how it would be received. And in the waiting, losing the moment entirely, watching it close, quietly, while I was still deciding whether to step through it. I have lost conversations that mattered because I arrived at them a season too late. Said things to people after the window had closed that would have changed everything if I would said them while it was still open. Held back the truest version of what I felt because the honest expression of it seemed like more exposure than I was ready for, and then watched the opportunity pass and lived with the particular grief of knowing that I had the words and chose the silence. That grief is specific. It does not generalize. It attaches to individual moments, individual people, individual things left unsaid. And it does not resolve through rationalization or through the reasonable observation that you could not have known at the time that the window was about to close. You just know that it did. and that you are still standing on the wrong side of it. I am telling you this because I think you may have your own version of this grief. Seasons that ended before you found the language for what you were carrying inside them. To say plainly what you needed instead of managing around the need with grace and discretion. And I want to suggest something about that grief that I have found genuinely useful. It is not only about the past. The grief of things unsaid, when you look at it squarely, is also a map. It shows you, specifically, personally, without ambiguity, what you actually value. What you would reach for again if reaching were still available. What kinds of moments and connections and honesty you are still hungry for. Even now, even here, much as it is pointing back. It is telling you something about what still matters. About what you would do differently if you could. And therefore about what you might still do. Not the same thing, not in the same form, but in the essential spirit of it. With the time and the will and the specific, tested, hard-won capacity you actually possess right now. There is something I want to say about dignity. Not as an abstract concept. Not as a quality that gets assigned to people from outside, awarded for comportment or grace under pressure, or the admirable management of difficult circumstances. But dignity as an interior experience, as something you either feel in yourself, or you do not, and the presence or absence of which determines the quality of how you inhabit your own life. I have been in rooms with enormously powerful people who had no interior dignity, who were externally impressive, commanding, credentialed, visibly successful by every available measure, and yet somehow fundamentally self-diminished, living in a kind of quiet contraction inside the large performance of their public presence, relating to themselves with a harshness, or a dismissiveness, or a fundamental disrespect for their own genuine needs and genuine nature that no external achievement had been able to correct. And I have been in rooms with people who had very little by the world's measures and everything that argued against it. There is a particular kind of mourning that I think you know. Not the mornings with agenda. Not the ones that begin with lists and obligations and the immediate forward pull of things that need doing. But the slower mornings, the ones where you surface from sleep gradually and lie still for a moment before the day assembles itself around you. Where consciousness returns gently, and there is a brief, unguarded interval before the familiar weight of everything settles back into its usual place. In that interval, in those few unhurried seconds before the day fully claims you, something honest is sometimes briefly visible. Something that the managed, forward-moving, socially presentable version of your day will shortly require you to set aside. A clarity about what you actually feel, about what the life you are living actually costs, and what it actually offers, about what you are carrying and what you are hoping for, and what you are quietly grieving in a register too low for ordinary conversation. I have learned to pay attention to those intervals, not to dramatize them, not to build elaborate interpretations around the thoughts that surface in the unguarded moments between sleep and full waking, but simply to notice them, to give them a moment of honest acknowledgement before the day's requirements redirect my attention outward, because those moments are telling you something your more organized, more functional, more socially available self has learned to efficiently manage around. And the something they are telling you is not a problem to be solved. It is the actual interior condition of your life, the real one, underneath the one you maintain for the world, asking, quietly, and with considerable patience, to simply be acknowledged. I want particularly for people who have spent decades being capable. Being the one who identified the problem and moved toward the solution. Being the person others turned to when something needed addressing, because you're competent and let it be difficult. That instinct is a gift. I do not want to suggest otherwise. Enormous amounts of human suffering would go unaddressed, and enormous amounts of necessary work would go undone. But the instinct has a shadow side when it is turned inward. When the same person who moves so effectively toward other people's pain turns that same energy toward their own interior life, and immediately begins trying to fix what they find there. Because the interior life is not always a problem to be solved. Sometimes it is simply a condition to be inhabited, a grief to be sat with, a longing to be acknowledged, a question to be held open, rather than closed efficiently, with whatever answer is most immediately available. The most important moments of genuine internal change I have experienced did not come from solving something. They came from finally stopping trying to solve it, From sitting inside a difficulty long enough for it to reveal itself accurately, rather than rushing past it toward whatever resolution was most accessible. That patience with your own interior, that willingness to sit with what is genuinely unresolved without immediately engineering around it, is one of the most quietly radical things a person can practice. And it produces something that efficiency cannot: an honest relationship with yourself, a genuine familiarity with your own nature that does not require the mediation of activity or accomplishment or the constant motion of being useful. I want to speak now about something that I think sits at the center of what you are navigating in this particular season of your life. Something that not as a crisis, not as a loss of identity in the dramatic sense, but as a genuine, open, honest inquiry. Because the roles that organize your sense of yourself, the roles that gave your days their structure, and your efforts their direction, and your presence its clear relational purpose, those roles have evolved. The version of you they originally called forward is no longer quite the version being called forward now. And in the space that creates, in the genuine openness of a life that is no longer as completely organized by others' needs, there is both an arcade shifts. The disorientation is genuine. The question of what you are for, asked now not rhetorically but practically, in the actual texture of how you spend your days and direct your attention, that question can feel destabilizing in a way that nothing external quite prepares you for. But the invitation is also real. And I think it is one that most people, in the press of managing the disorientation, do not stop long enough to actually receive. The invitation is this. For perhaps the first time in a very long time, the definition of who you are is genuinely up for reconsideration. Not because the previous definition was wrong. Not because the life you built in those roles was insufficient or wasted. But because you are no longer primarily required to be someone specific for other people's purposes. And in that freedom, unfamiliar, and sometimes uncomfortable, as it is, lies a genuine possibility. The possibility of choosing who you are from the inside outward, rather than from the outside inward. I have had, across the arc of my working life, moments where the constraints lifted unexpectedly, where a project ended or a crisis resolved, and reclaimed my attention. There was sometimes a brief, disorienting, genuinely interesting period where I had to confront the question of what I actually wanted to do with unstructured time. The honest answer was sometimes surprising. Sometimes the thing I reached for in those unconstrained moments was not the next ambitious thing. It was something much quieter. A conversation without agenda. An hour of reading something with no professional application. Those moments revealed something that the relentless forward motion of my professional life made it easy to forget. That the interior of a person is not made only of ambition and capability and the drive towards significant outcomes. That underneath all of that, sometimes quite far underneath, in people like me who have spent decades leading with the ambitious version, there is a simpler, quieter self that wants simpler, fortunate enough to be genuinely close to you. I want to say something about the people who are currently in your life. Not about any individual specifically, because I do not know your particular circumstances with that precision, but about the general question of closeness, of who actually knows you, and how well, and what that knowing consists of. There is a difference between people who are familiar with you and people who actually know you. Familiarity accumulates through time and proximity. It builds a detailed map of your habits and preferences and the surface texture of your daily life. Familiarity knows what you like for breakfast, and how you take your coffee, and what subjects make you uncomfortable, and which memories you return to in conversation. Knowing is different. Knowing involves access to the interior. To the room I spoke about earlier, the one where the unedited version lives. Knowing requires that you have allowed someone past the presentation, past the managed side difficulty. Knowing requires that you have let someone see you uncertain, unresolved, genuinely afraid of something, wanting something you were not sure you deserved to want, grieving something in a way that did not resolve cleanly or quickly into the dignified acceptance that would have been easier for everyone. How many people know you in that sense? I ask that not to make you lonely, but to make you honest. Because I think the number is probably smaller than the number of people who are familiar with you. And I think that gap that can exist inside even a populated, well-connected life. The remedy for that gap is not to find new people. Not necessarily. Not first. The remedy begins with the decision to allow the knowing to open the interior room gradually, and with appropriate discernment, to the people who have demonstrated the quality of attention that genuine knowing requires. It begins with trusting that the full version of you, not the capable version, not the graceful version, who have quietly developed a specific doubt about whether the non-capable version of themselves, being known as the one who holds things together. It is, unequivocally, the uncertain version is not less than the capable one. It is the same person in a less defended moment. And less defended is not weaker. That can be surprised, moved, genuinely changed by an encounter with something true. Less defended is, in fact, the version most capable of genuine connection. Because genuine connection requires that both people be actually present, not performing at each other, not managing the impression they are creating, not leading exclusively with the most composed version of themselves, but actually present, actually in contact, actually willing to be affected by what happens between them. I want to be affected by what happens between us. In this conversation, on this particular, not have a dramatic name or a visible external marker. But something real has moved through these words, a quality of honesty that I do not often find the space to offer, and that you have received with a quality of openness that I do not think you offer carelessly. That exchange matters. Even in this unusual form. Even across this unexpected distance. Even in the absence of all the ordinary markers of genuine human encounter. It matters because honesty received honestly is one of the most human things that can happen between two people. And it has happened here, tonight, between you and me.